It may be that I was probably born with a sense of drama.
The more one becomes familiar with Hitchcock, you could see a scene from any one of his movies and immediately know that only he could have directed it.
When you can clearly see somebody's stamp and imprint on movie after movie after movie, to me that makes them an auteur because their vision is coming across.
There was certainly a massive streak of darkness when he gives in to his compulsions, when he gives in to his proclivities within his movies. I have no doubt you find the root of Alfred Hitchcock.
People are the movies they make, and their movies are representations of who they are.
Hitchcock made films that reflected so much of his personality and his interests and his fears. You see a series of films by Hitchcock, and suddenly you recognize a style, a point of view, a focus, an interest in certain things.
Hitchcock was exposing so much of his soul in the films that seems to articulate the same point of view again and again. And when you see a guy utilize that so brilliantly, you understand style is substance.
When I was younger, I always saw Hitchcock as entertainment. The moment I went to film school, we began to analyze it. And that's when you begin to say, these are tools that one can use. If you need to express something in a particular way, you can look back to his work, back to Hitchcock's.
We have a rectangular screen in a movie house. Now, this rectangular screen has got to be filled with a succession of images. One picture comes up after another.
Hitchcock was one of the first masters of real visual storytelling. One of the reasons that he's known for so many memorable scenes and sequences, it's not necessarily for the dialogue, but he was the guy who learned how to tell stories visually.
Bang, bang!
Hitchcock's career began in the silent film era, and he retained a respect for the silent film experience throughout his career.
He loved silent movies because the grammar was all about imagery.
My instincts are to go first for the visual and not follow the words of the novel. Follow the storyline if you like, but retell it in cinematic form.
You have to have a story, you have to have dialogue, you have to have actions and people talking with each other and all the things that movies have. But the idea is that a movie is a kind of total experience.
50% of the storytelling in the movie is done purely by cinema, by angles, by light, by music, by composition, and so forth.
He felt that when you sit in a movie theater, you're watching this huge screen in a darkened room, and there's all these great big pictures and actions and movements and colors, and all these things are coming together. And compared with that, words are pretty puny.
Everybody can learn from Hitchcock one thing. Even at his most brutal, or at his most polished, he was always incredibly precise as a narrator.
He was a master craftsman. You know, he knew all the tools.
Don't come any nearer. You get back.
And he knew when to employ them.
The shot of the United Nations General Assembly building in North by Northwest is to die for. There is simply no other director, okay, who has that kind of range as a visual analyst.
He developed a particular style which we talk about now, putting the audience into the point of view of the character.
The subjective camera, where the camera takes the place of one of the characters, and the other characters address the camera as though they're addressing an actor. That's done in Hitchcock's films often,
Now, I'm inclined to go for the subjective. In other words, the point of view of an individual. Visually, you do a close-up of him, then you show what he is looking at. Then you cut back to the close-up and you see his reaction. And you can use it in many, many, many ways.
The inserts in The Wrong Man are very interesting in terms of cinema, particularly when people start to look at him and it cuts to the people's points of view. They see him, certainly, from the way the camera's positioned, the way the camera's moving, he's guilty.
I wonder if you'd look at this policy for me and tell me how much we can borrow on it.
The camera has a paranoia to it that makes you feel he's guilty. So then he has a guilty sort of look in his face, almost. But we know he's not guilty. And so that's their point of view.
Never called my wife.
That's been taken care of.
Point of view editing in particular is something you're going to see that come across in almost every one of Hitchcock's films. And by doing so, he's able to put the audience into the mind of the character.
When Henry Fonda sits in the cot and he looks at the room, then you see 2 or 3 cuts of his point of view. He sees the sink, he sees the ceiling, but when you go to position the camera, where is he looking in the ceiling? The camera has to become the character, and the shot of the ceiling tells you more about what he's feeling than a shot of his face. There's something specific about those angles where he feels completely closed in and claustrophobic.
If you look at any one of those single images by themselves, as you can in a book, it's not going to be as effective as the combination of them. Because that's what he was a master of. This combination of images leading one to another, they are like musical passages.
Very often, I watch them without the sound, because as I say, the Hitchcock films are like a piece of music. The rhythm, the cutting.
He was so confident in his visual storytelling ability that these shots feel inevitable as one follows the other. It feels like there could be no other shot there because it wouldn't make sense.
Hitchcock builds the tension and builds the suspense and builds the sense of menace and chaos and confusion by editing.
Some directors might just sit back wide, holding shots. Hitchcock gets you right in close and gets you part of the action. And it's more of an impressionistic idea.
By just taking all these different shots from all these different angles and distances of all the different elements of the scene, and then putting them together in a kind of a magnificent collage, so that by seeing one thing after another, I think I'll take the shortcut. Some of the shots so fast you can hardly even take them in. You get this tremendous sense of the movie rushing to a climax.
Johnny! Johnny!
I think it would be interesting to talk about fear.
Help! Help me! Anytime when there's suspense involved, you can't help but think about Hitchcock.
His building of suspense was the key element. I mean, he mapped the territory, so to speak. He was the original.
To get real suspense, you must let the audience have information.
You do my murder, I do yours. Your wife, my father. Crisscross.
It involves the audience's expectancy that something is about to happen. This was, I think, his guiding principle. Suspense versus shock.
Is your name Miriam?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Hitchcock was maybe the first person to ever say in articulate terms what the difference is between suspense and surprise in movie storytelling.
Now let's take the old-fashioned bomb theory. You and I are sitting talking, we'll say, about baseball. We're talking for 5 minutes. Suddenly a bomb goes off. The audience have a 10-second terrible shock.
Everybody in the audience jumps, and that's a surprise, and it's very effective. But it's also over in a few seconds.
Now, let's take the same situation, tell the audience at the beginning that under the table, and show it to them. There's a bomb, and it's going to go off in 5 minutes. Now, and we talk baseball. What are the audience doing? They're saying, don't talk about baseball. There's a bomb under there. Get rid of it.
They'll sit there and watch it because Hitchcock has promised them that something's going to happen.
I should simply tell them that you're trying to blackmail me into murdering your wife.
In Dial for Murder, he's building up to the scene where Ray Milland has his old school chum come and visit him, and he lays out his plan for this guy to kill his wife.
When would this take place?
Tomorrow night.
Tomorrow? Not a chance.
And then, at a certain point, when he starts to explain his plan, they cut to that extreme angle. It's a very high angle down. And that positioning of the camera and that cut made you feel something was amiss, something was going to happen. And it kept building the tension that way.
Go straight to the window. Hide behind the curtain. At exactly 11 o'clock, I shall go to the telephone in the hotel to call my boss. I shall dial the wrong number. This number. That's all I shall do. When the phone rings, you'll see the light go on under her bedroom door. When she opens it, the light will stream across the room. So don't move until she answers the phone.
What works with Hitchcock's films is that he tells you very clearly right up front that certain things are going to happen.
Hello?
And then he makes you suffer.
Hello?
And makes you wait for that moment as long as humanly possible.
Hello?
He believed in the power of fear.
Hello? 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 Hello?
That's hard to do. I mean, it's very hard to frighten an audience. The audience knows they're seeing a movie. But that's what Hitchcock was doing, constantly, because of the audience's anticipation that that bomb was going to go off.
But one important factor, if you work the audience up to this degree, that bomb must never go off and kill anyone. Otherwise, they will be extremely angry with you. Now, we inside are all safe and sound.
In Hitchcock's films, you generally find that at the end, the bad people get their comeuppance.
A murder story is a murder story, but by whom? I mean, who do you choose as a character? And that's where the difference comes.
In Dial M for Murder, you're actually, for some moments in the film, you're rooting for Ray Milland, a very fascinating character.
What is it?
I'd better get a blanket.
Father Logan will go to them. He will tell them.
Hitchcock's villains sometimes are more interesting than the protagonists.
He will tell them. He cannot tell them what he heard in confession.
As Hitchcock is reputed to have said, the more interesting the villain, the more interesting the movie.
In Strangers on a Train, certainly, Bruno Antony is a much more interesting character than the protagonist.
Oh, Mother, you're wonderful. That's the old boy, all right. That's Father.
Hitchcock found the dark places in the human heart that, when unleashed, can wreak havoc.
There's nothing wrong with my mind. Nobody can prove that there is unless...
What gets you in suspense about Hitchcock, what gets you riveted to the screen, is Hitchcock putting you in the mind of a character, whichever character that he chooses.
Supposing there's a burglar stealing jewelry from a woman. Now, the woman has gone out, but suddenly she comes back and comes in the front door. What do the audience say? Quick, burglar, get out, get out. You'll get caught. They have no feeling for the victim, but they want him not to be caught. You see, it's the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not be found out.
In some movies, at some points, Hitchcock actually gets us into the shoes of the bad guy, and we feel what the bad guy is feeling
In Strangers on a Train, one of the things Hitchcock does is he manipulates the audience into rooting for Bruno, the villain.
He said if the police ever found your lighter there, that's all they'd need. Something to prove that you were at the scene of the murder.
He's going to put my lighter on that island.
The protagonist, Guy Haynes, needs to stop Bruno from getting that incriminating cigarette lighter onto the island. Bruno gets off the train and someone bumps into him. The cigarette lighter drops down into a storm drain. And now we, the audience, although we're rooting for Guy, we find ourselves hoping that Bruno's going to be able to get that cigarette lighter out from the drain.
You are on the edge of your seat because you have been now made to identify with the guy you hate the most.
And if we're really thinking about our own personalities and our own ways of reacting to movies and all the different social forces around us, we might realize, maybe I have a touch of that lunatic guy in Strangers on a Train in me.
Finally, he grasps it, and we find ourselves overcome with a sense of relief that he got the lighter.
Hitchcock plays with you on that. He plays in very deep, psychologically touchy areas. That's what makes it very sustainable over the years as films. That it speaks out to another generation, because it deals with very primal issues.
Our evil and our good are getting closer together.
Hitchcock's sense of innocence being corrupted and suddenly the symbol of something innocent becomes something evil.
But they're lovely dolls. They're prettiest. Yes.
Hitchcock knows that there is not such a thing as an innocent object, because an object in film works exclusively in context.
You do love me, don't you? I think he's dead. I'm sure he's dead. I didn't mean it.
If the context is sufficiently elaborate, you can make the most inoffensive object look menacing.
One example to me in Stage Fright is the moment when Alistair Sim wants to bring this blood-stained doll up to Marlene Dietrich while she's singing the song in the tent. So now you see this little boy carrying this doll with this big blood stain on it, and it suddenly becomes something quite other than this doll.
C'est lui pour moi, moi pour lui dans la vie. Il me l'a dit, l'a juré, pour la vie.
One ordinary object that Hitchcock really was able to get a great deal of menace out of was the glass of milk in Suspicion. An ordinary, simple glass of milk, but we're wondering, does it contain poison or not? And he actually managed to put that menace into this glass by putting a light bulb inside the glass, and the scene is completely dark as Cary Grant ascends the staircase, and all we see is that glass of milk, and we're focused on it.
It's that turning of very everyday things into dark things. It strikes you at the core of the primordial gel in the middle of your brain reacts to those things.
Hey, Bruno!
One of Hitchcock's favorite motifs is to take a symbol or place associated with childhood innocence and turn it into an arena of menace. The climactic last scene of Strangers on a Train is a surrealist masterpiece.
This is typical Hitchcock, the most innocent and childish amusement ride there is. You know, the roller coaster, well, that's scary, but merry-go-round. Hitchcock turns it into an instrument of pure horror by having it go out of control and spinning around and spinning around.
Get someone to stop this thing.
I can handle it.
All of its painted horses suddenly begin to go mad, whirling and whirling madly, and then beginning a kind of mental breakdown. So that as you're watching, you can't believe what you're seeing. It's sort of the shattering of all human illusions, all human conventions, and this general kind of catastrophe. It's all about a merry-go-round. He's a prankster.
I think one of the really appealing things about Hitchcock's movies are that even if you are terrified, or even if you're sort of, clutching your seat, waiting to see what's going to happen, his wicked sense of humor comes through in almost everything he makes.
I think in suspense, an audience wants to have a little relief and change of pace and a laugh if necessary.
Hitchcock had a fantastic sense of humor. His actors and writers and colleagues will tell stories by the hours of Hitch's humor, much of which could not be repeated in polite company.
That comes through in almost everything he makes. There's always a little sense of humor. There's always a little fun. There's always a bit of a wink.
Somebody call the police.
He will insert himself into a scene, or he'll play odd little jokes.
Here you are, with the biggest cigar in the business.
The Hitchcock cameo, that's really something you're going to see in almost every one of Hitchcock's films. Most often it was something tongue-in-cheek, done with a little bit of humor.
I'm Doris Dinsdale. I'm from Nellie.
There's a kind of childlike quality to him, a playing with the audience. He's always making sexual innuendo puns.
Now, what can a man do with his clothes off for 20 minutes?
Oh, David. Oh.
Given the confines of what he could show at the period with the American restrictions on sex, he was very clever. The tunnel at the end of North by Northwest has sexual connotations, the train entering the tunnel. Can't think what he meant by it.
His humor was mischievous. No one was more mischievous than Hitchcock.
I can take him out in the car, and when we get to a very lonely spot, knock him on the head with a hammer, pour gasoline over him and over the car, and set the whole thing ablaze.
It can be outrageously wide and broad.
They poured a whole bottle of bourbon into me. No, they didn't give me a chaser.
Or it can be in slight touches.
I remember in Gloucester, where we exhumed the body 4 years after, there was still enough poison even in the fingernails and the hair.
It's a particular brand of humor that I think I associate with the English.
A fascinating story about a Chinese executioner who was able to wield a sword so skillfully that there was an occasion when a victim mounted the steps onto a platform and the executionist was slightly behind him. And the victim said, "Mr. Executioner, please don't keep me standing here in agony. Why don't you do your work?" And the executioner said, "My dear sir, please nod your head slightly."
In the face of horrible things, there is always an incredibly civilized retort.
Not that I mind a slight case of abduction now and then, but I have tickets for the theater this evening.
An almost drab sense of irony in the face of tragedy.
Apparently, the only performance that'll satisfy you is when I play dead. Your very next role will be quite convincing, I assure you.
There's a funny moment in North by Northwest at the intelligence agency where one of the operatives says,
"So horribly sad, how is it I feel like laughing?"
and that's something that Hitchcock really put into most of his films.
Now get me out of these weeds. I'm beginning to feel sad, and I shouldn't feel sad. It's so depressing.
Really, the audience are being nursed along, petted and worried about, so that they laugh while pieces of plot are being thrust into their minds.
And here's the most important thing. As you go out, return the key to the place where you found it.
Under the stair carpet?
Yes.
There's always something in a Hitchcock movie that means a lot to the characters, but it doesn't really mean anything to us in the audience, and there's no reason why it should.
It took me just half an hour to find it.
It's what we call the MacGuffin.
See how much you've got.
The MacGuffin is the thing that the characters are after, but the audience don't care.
The object that keeps the plot moving, but is of no interest to him or us beyond that.
When a murder has been committed, each scrap of information is important to the police.
Have you washed the cassock?
Not yet.
Don't wash it. I don't want it washed.
Hitchcock's MacGuffins were simply a plot device. It's misdirection.
You have examined the stains on this cassock? I have, sir. Would you tell the court what they are? They're human blood.
A priest was seen leaving Ballette's house at the time of the murder.
The only reason it's in the movie is to give the characters something to get all hot and bothered about, so that they'll do things and make a story for us to watch.
My dress. There's blood in it.
The MacGuffin doesn't matter at all. You have to have it because the character must be after something.
What's this doing here anyhow? It should have been destroyed hours ago.
The word comes from a joke that Hitchcock used to tell about a guy who's on a train and he sees some sort of a weird contraption in the luggage rack overhead.
"Excuse me, sir, what is that strange-looking package above your head?" And all that. He said, "That's a MacGuffin." He said, "What's that? What's that for?" He said, "That's for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." So the other man said, "But there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands." He said, "Then that's no MacGuffin."
300, thank you. Now the 4. Do I hear 4?
I reduced it to its minimum in North by Northwest when Cary Grant says to the CIA man,
Tell me, what's Van Damme up to?
Oh, you could say he's a sort of importer-exporter.
Of what?
Oh, government secrets, perhaps?
And that's all we had to say about it.
Eventually, we'd find out that this whole big, complicated chase situation has been about some microfilm that's about to be smuggled out of the country.
The figure that they got at the auction sale last night is filled with microfilm.
That's how he's been getting it.
But we don't know what's on the microfilm. We don't even see the microfilm until almost the end of the movie. We don't even know about the microfilm until almost the end of the movie. It's just there for the characters to have something to get involved with, for the story to kind of revolve around.
Get that figure back from her. I see you've got the pumpkin.
Yes.
Why don't we talk about heroines? You know, I've often been asked why I choose what people seem to call cool blondes.
He loved women. I mean, you can tell by some of the movies that there's this love of the Hollywood blonde.
He begins using these blonde women, from Joan Fontaine in Suspicion to Carol Lombard in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Grace Kelly in Dial M for Murder, and right up through Eva Marie Saint in North by Northwest.
Hitchcock was obsessed with blondes dressed jaw-droppingly beautiful.
I think the blonde really stems from the tradition of the cinema, whose first heroine was a curly-headed blonde named Mary Pickford.
I suppose he was relying on the cliches of the day. Gentlemen prefer blondes, and later on, blondes have more fun. According to Hitchcock, not in my films they don't.
It's part of the quest romance of his films, that he wants women to go through a kind of strange rite de passage, almost of torture in some cases. He sees her as a perfect artifact in a way, and therefore he enjoys smashing it.
But I didn't realize how madly infatuated he was with me. I just didn't realize. You'll never know how much I blame myself for all this.
The Hitchcock blonde embodies an incredibly perfect, incredibly poised, incredibly cold, and morally ambivalent female character most of the time.
He wouldn't let me alone. Or maybe if I'd agreed to see him, he wouldn't have done this dreadful thing.
I think it is fascinating when you look at the Hitchcock women that every single one of them is slightly remote and has this sense of allure. You'd rarely see women in Hitchcock films as warm, as earthy creatures. He liked to keep his women cocooned.
The female lead is utterly desirable and at the same time completely asexual.
I personally object to the blondes who wear their sex round their neck and it hangs in front of them like oversized jewelry. I've always felt that you should try and discover in the course of your story whether the woman is sexy or not.
It's going to be a long night.
True.
And I don't particularly like the book I've started.
Ah.
You know what I mean?
Let me think. Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
When I think of the Hitchcock blonde, I think of a coolness with heat simmering underneath.
Hitchcock relished these situations in which these blonde women would break down a man's guard. And he would open himself up to these women, become vulnerable, whether or not they were going to love him for it or kill him.
Hitchcock felt women's beauty as taunting, as ungraspable, as indefinable. He thought of them as semi-goddesses.
And they are quite incredible, quite iconic confections, the Hitchcock blondes.
In Hitchcock's kind of golden age, that's what people wanted to see. People wanted to see beautiful people on screen, and people wanted to see the perfect moment, and they wanted life and stories to be sort of idealized in a certain way.
Hitchcock has a fascination with glamour. That is a trademark. He was very preoccupied with delivering the highest quality of product.
It isn't like seeing an ordinary whodunit. It's so much better accomplished than that. The way it looks is always immaculate. The clothes are always perfect for the characters. The atmosphere always feels exactly right. And it's almost always a world that you rather want to get into.
It's what he enjoyed, and I think it's also what he knew that audiences enjoyed when they go to a movie.
In those days, it was glamour. The hair was glamour, the makeup was glamour, the wardrobe was glamour.
Your first impression is, wow, look at that dress.
I'm sorry, I'm late. I believe this is our dance, isn't it?
Hitchcock had a great interest in clothing for both men and women, to the extent that it's almost a fetishism. He would personally choose the outfits that his leading ladies wore, like Eva Marie Saint in North by Northwest.
I once had the opportunity to ask Eva Marie Saint about the beautiful dress she wears in North by Northwest. She lit up as she described how Hitch had taken her to Bergdorf's, and they had sat side by side, watching as one after the other the models came out wearing the different outfits. All these years later, the enjoyment of that dream date was still fresh in her voice and eyes.
His background was in black and white films, and I think with that came a depth of sense about color, where he believes that color is something that you should treat with great care.
Alfred Hitchcock films always associated fashion with character. The fashion was always impeccable, but also a lesson in character development through fashion.
They are telling a story when a shirt lacks a button, or if it has 3 buttons or 4 buttons, or if it has no buttons. Does this character wake up in the morning and tie his shoes, or does he wear slippers or sandals, or, it defines, it's storytelling. Every piece of fabric, every swatch of color told a story.
People are more immaculately dressed, their hair is more perfect, but you never look at them and go, who are these people?
It's not 'cause she wouldn't, it's not 'cause she shouldn't, and you know it's not 'cause she couldn't, it's simply because
I'm the laziest gal in town.
I think audiences don't leave their homes to go and see their own lives. They want to see something which is cinema, and I think he understood that in a way that many directors don't.
Hitchcock was able to take what was everybody else's idea of the American dream and just lift it a notch. So you looked at it and went, ah, what a wonderful world that is. But I don't know how much reality there was to that world. It's a very different world.
Hitchcock's films are a feast for the eyes. We feel that our senses are heightened because the director has this artistic sensorium for the visual as well as the auditory.
The only thing wrong with the silent film was the fact that people opened their mouths and no sound came out.
I'd like to break her neck. I said I'd like to break her foul, useless little neck. What's that? I said I could strangle her!
Hitchcock always looked at the new technology, whether it was cameras or lenses or sound, and thought, well, how can he use it to tell his particular stories?
So you see, I've come to you. I thought maybe you could tell me what to do. How much do you want? Well, the thought of money never entered my head, madam. I hope you won't think that of me.
Hitchcock used all of the power of sound, pure sound, not words, to affect the audience. And sounds that are not connected with things that are happening in the movie, like you see a gun being fired and you hear the gunshot. You have these kind of disembodied sounds.
He put sound in that wasn't necessarily the actual or the practical sound of the location.
The idea would be to have the sound counterpoint to the visual. If you show a girl's face and she's smiling, now the dialogue shouldn't be, I am feeling happy, because the words are making the same statement as the girl's face.
Quite often he used the aspect of counterpoint to create drama. In Strangers on a Train, the murder takes place in an amusement park where this happy-go-lucky song the band played on is playing while the murder is committed. Of course, there's counterpoint right away because it's this happy song, it's something with frivolity. You hear it while the killer is stalking the victim and then a strangulation.
The soundtrack is there not simply to support the imagery, but to contrast with it.
He exploded the idea that sound just reinforced what you were saying. He used the soundtrack as a whole other conduit to tell a part of the story that you couldn't see.
Restart the bidding. Another example of counterpoint would be in North by Northwest, where Roger Thornhill barges into this art auction and confronts the bad guys. 1,000, thank you. 1,000 at 1,000, say 1,100. You might think, because of the way the story's going, this is a point where they would fight each other or try to do each other in.
Good evening, Mr. Kaplan. Before we start calling each other names, perhaps you'd better tell me yours.
But because they're caught in public in this art auction, there's a tremendous tension played by the fact that they can't raise their voices.
Start the bidding. Mr. Kaplan, we've had just about enough of you. Then why don't you send for the police?
600.
That's the last thing you'd want, isn't it? Me in the hands of the police.
A sound designer nowadays doing big action films like The Dark Knight or something, you create big sounds, big explosions, trucks blowing up, fights, mayhem. Hitchcock was very selective in the use of sound.
Very often the sound of something will be the major element in the film itself.
Dial M for Murder, in a certain sense, there's only 2 sound effects in that movie. The sound of the telephone ringing and the sound of a key going into an apartment door. But because they're 2 of the only things you hear in the movie, and there's such a build-up to them, they become very significant.
There are many examples in Hitchcock's films of not only how sound is used, but how it is restrained.
Silence is very important because silence is what can predicate a shock moment. Hitchcock was not afraid to be quiet. Take, for instance, stage fright. You have Richard Todd going to the scene of the crime. It's extremely quiet. There's just no sound. There's no music. There's nothing saying this is suspenseful. But because you have silence, then when the maid suddenly appears, it's a shock. It makes you jump.
The prairie scene in North by Northwest, a lot of it plays with no sound. Not even the sound of the distant wind in the prairie. But then all of a sudden, there will be the interruption of a car going by. Very simple things that are really, when you examine them, part of a sound palette.
Cary Grant is let off out in the middle of this Iowa cornfield, and he finds himself looking at another man standing across the street, and there's no dialogue between them, and there's hardly any sound. It's that silence that makes it creepy.
The soundtrack becomes so quiet that it becomes unnerving.
You're thinking at any minute the man's going to pull out a gun, or he's going to pull out a knife, or there's going to be a scream or something to shock you, and it doesn't happen. But you're really drawn into that, and you're drawn into it by the use of silence.
Hot day.
And then what occurs after it, where the track becomes a screaming presence, just destroys the audience's ability to resist.
You can't ignore the role that music plays in the Hitchcock films, especially when you've got Bernard Herrmann or Dmitri Tiomkin as your composer. Quite often, they will take over at certain big moments, and they will illustrate with music what might be going on in the characters' heads. In particular, in I Confess, it might just be a shot of Montgomery Clift walking from the rectory to the church nearby, just a scene of a man walking, and the music is almost trapped inside of his head, trying to escape and tell people the confession that Hoochie can't.
You can't tell them as long as you are a priest.
Can you?
Hitchcock was a Catholic, and one way to view his works is in a Freudian sense, and how much they represent of his own fears and sins.
Who's there?
Psychiatrists will tell you that if you have certain psychological problems, that if you can trace them back to, say, your childhood, all will be released.
I must confess to you. I must tell someone. I want to make a confession.
It was Alfred Hitchcock's Jesuit education that we'd always refer back to, saying that it was the fear that the Jesuit priests instilled in him that made him go into the direction of movies that he did.
He never stopped distrusting authority, and it kind of bent him the way he was.
When I was at a Jesuit college called St. Ignatius, the method of punishment was rather a dramatic thing, I felt. A special priest in a special room would, with the help of a soft black rubber, grab the hand that was to be punished and lay this thing in.
What makes Hitchcock great in my mind is that he was articulating his main conflict with the world. He was raised Catholic, but he was drawn to murder, to compulsion, to fetishism.
He was not a practicing Catholic, he was a lapsed Catholic. So there had to be a degree of guilt that he felt about some of the ideas that he entertained throughout his life.
He looked at me. His hands were on her throat. And he was strangling me.
Hitchcock's strong sense of convention, his strong sense of social expectation, is something that he's always exploding and subverting. The art auction scene in North by Northwest is a very good example of Hitchcock's ability to observe the way people behave in ritualized formula.
12 is bid. I have 12. Go 13. Who'll say 13?
$13.
You mean 1,300, sir?
No, I mean $13. That's more than it's worth.
The auction is slowly disrupted by Cary Grant trying to save his own life as Roger Thornhill by making everything go mad.
I have 1,200 once, 1,200 twice.
3,000.
Sold for 1,200.
All of Hitchcock's films can be regarded as an attempt to kind of like throw a bomb under the frock of the nearest priest.
Now, I'm not going to let you get away with that. That's unfair. You'd better leave, sir. No, you take your hands off me or I'll sue you. Uh-oh, the... Well, what took you so long?
Let's take a little walk.
Well, now, wait a minute.
Get moving.
I haven't finished fitting yet. 3,000, I bid 3,000.
In every which way, he is, in my mind, a Catholic filmmaker. The Christ-like figures that you can find recurrently being sacrificed and paraded and crucified by the mob. Montgomery Clift in I Confess. Henry Fonda in The Wrong Man.
Am I being accused of something? Who says I'm a hold-up man or look like one? What hold-up are you talking about? Don't I have a right to know?
The Wrong Man certainly has symbolic elements of crucifixion.
Because of the Catholic connection, I think that has a lot to do with this yearning to remain innocent. We talk about the innocence of the Garden of Eden coming from the Bible, or Paradise Lost, Milton.
An innocent man has nothing to fear. Remember that.
Hitchcock is very good at tapping into common psychological fears, the way he brings in police in almost every movie. Hitchcock had a certain paranoia about police and a fear of being arrested, a fear of confinement.
He used to quote that anecdote of him being locked in a jail cell by his father's wish.
My father sent me with a note to the local chief of police, who glanced at the little piece of paper and then led me along a corridor, and I was locked in a cell for 5 minutes. Then he let me out and said, that's what we do to naughty boys.
And I think in some ways Hitchcock, as we know him, crystallized at that moment. I have no doubt it comes from a guy that was not in control of his own life when he was a kid. And as a filmmaker, the greatest revenge for that vertigo of youth that you can experience is to try and control the audience into an experience that simulates life for you.
And I'm going to ask you that when the proof is all in, to see if you don't say to yourself that this is a tragic case of a mistaken identity.
The fear of losing one's identity and losing control of one's own life is a theme throughout many of Hitchcock's films. With The Wrong Man, and it's really exemplified in North by Northwest, that he is, because of a simple wave of a hand, mistaken for someone else.
George Kaplan.
Boy.
My name is Thornhill, Roger Thornhill. There's never been anything else.
Kaplan.
I told you, I'm not Kaplan, whoever he is. Do sit down, Mr. Kaplan.
The innocent man on the run. This is something that he used time and again. It's really his own signature theme.
Ideas like this, which he would work out in all kinds of intricate ways and show them from all different kinds of angles, it amounts to a whole philosophy of life that we're seeing.
Any art form is there for the artist to interpret it in his own way and thus create an emotion.
In the way that you recognize the quirks of Mozart expressing the core of his art through the technique. Hitchcock repeats motifs, he repeats rhythms.
Want to hear one of my ideas for a perfect murder?
Do you really believe in the perfect murder?
Yes, absolutely.
If you're going to kill somebody, do it simply. Am I right, Dr. Sedbusk?
You're going to do a murder. How are you going to do it?
How would you do it simply?
I don't know, but I'd use the most obvious method.
How about a little poison?
For instance, poison.
Yes, I usually put myself in the criminal's shoes, and I keep asking myself, what do I do next?
The most important thing is that no one should suspect me.
Hitchcock had the compulsion of a fetishist. He could not help himself but to craft murder like a love scene. He could not help himself but to craft these perfect cold blonde women to bring them down. He was essentially exposing a very dark side of his soul.
For the most part, Hitchcock's theme is an isolated man surrounded by hostile elements. That can be said to be the theme of most, if not all, of Hitchcock's great suspense films. That's the major theme of The Wrong Man, North by Northwest.
You can very much see in patterns of things and the types of characters, from the leading man to the girl in it, to the idea of the MacGuffin of what they're searching for, to the types of locations he's chosen, to that final moment with somebody hanging off of a cliff.
He repeats a risk at great heights over and over again in his work. The idea of the void absorbing the gravity, pulling you down, it is just compulsively part of his work. Because I think when you're afraid of heights, what you really want is to jump from that ledge. That's the real compulsion, and you're repressing it with fear. But if that is the case, I think that all of Hitchcock's movies are an exercise in that normalcy of daily life, being irretrievably attracted by darkness, by the void, by the nothingness, in the way that the sociopath that Cary Grant plays in Suspicion becomes an attractor to a good person.
His movies are more than just thrillers. Hitchcock was able to express very complicated philosophical views through these rattling good stories.
Sometimes you see a movie and you come out of it wondering why anybody wanted to make it. What was the undeniable impulse to tell that particular story? You never feel that way with a Hitchcock movie. He's dealing with themes and fears and issues that are very personal to him.
I think it was easier to know Hitchcock by his films than by meeting him in person. He was truly a guy with a darker side that was completely personal to him.
All of that repression and all of that neuroses expressed itself in this incredibly free and incredibly expressive way. There isn't a filmmaker alive who hasn't taken from Hitchcock. There is not a film that's been made since that hasn't in one way or another been influenced by his work.
He created the form, there's no question about it. You want to make a suspense film, that's the place you go to learn.
The unique combination of Hitchcock is that he was a master craftsman, peerless entertainer, and an artist, a great, great artist.
In my view, the greatest artist of sound cinema.